I'm standing in my 10-year-old daughter Emma's elementary school parking lot during pickup time with 5 different angry wives screaming at me all at once about how I had inappropriate relationships with their husbands while faking depression as an excuse, and now every parent and teacher is watching my entire lie get exposed in front of the whole neighborhood while my own kids see their mother being called terrible names, and I still can't believe they're making me the villain when all I did was try to find some happiness. Jennifer, whose construction worker husband David I'd been meeting at hotels, is waving receipts in my face while Lisa shows everyone screenshots of flirty text messages between me and her husband Kevin, my personal trainer. Maria, who's married to Carlos, the lawyer, has this whole poster board with timelines and photos of our restaurant dates like some kind of courtroom presentation, and Amanda is yelling about how I seduced her husband Jake while he was working from home doing IT consulting. The worst part is Dr. Peterson's wife Sarah, who I didn't even know existed, telling everyone I manipulated her therapist husband into inappropriate sessions, while my own children, Emma age 10 and Josh age 8, watch their mother get destroyed in front of their entire elementary school. But let me back up and explain how I got here, because this whole nightmare started 8 months ago when I was just a 34-year-old part-time dental receptionist trying to save myself from disappearing completely into the role of my husband Mike's wife and the kids' mom without any identity of my own. It started about 8 months ago when I was scrolling through Instagram and saw my college roommate Sarah posting from Paris with her new boyfriend looking so happy and free while I was sitting in my kitchen surrounded by dirty dishes and homework folders. That's when it hit me that I'd given up my entire identity to become just Mike's wife and the kids' mom, and I couldn't even remember who Rachel used to be before all this responsibility suffocated me. I began telling Mike I was feeling really depressed and needed some space to work on my mental health. At first, he was so supportive, asking what he could do to help and suggesting therapy, which made me feel guilty but also gave me the perfect cover story. I told him the therapist said I needed more time for self-care and that my depression was partly from feeling trapped in my routine. Mike started taking over more with the kids so I could have my evenings free, and that's when I downloaded a dating app just to see if I still had it. I wasn't planning to actually meet anyone, but when David from 2 streets over started messaging me about how lonely he felt in his marriage, I realized he understood what I was going through in ways Mike never could. David was 41 and worked in construction, and when he told me his wife Jennifer hadn't touched him in months, I felt so bad for him. We started meeting for coffee during my lunch breaks, and he would tell me how beautiful I was, and how Jennifer just didn't appreciate him anymore. When I mentioned my depression, he was so understanding, saying I deserved better support, and that Mike should be doing more to help me heal. After a few weeks, David suggested we get a private place, just to talk somewhere away from prying eyes, and I knew it was wrong, but I convinced myself this was part of my healing process. Being with someone who actually listened to me and made me feel desired again was like medicine for my broken spirit. I told Mike I was going to evening therapy sessions, when really I was meeting David at a quiet location downtown. The guilt was eating me alive, but I also felt more alive than I had in years. David would tell me how amazing I was, and how he wished he'd met me before he got married, and for the first time in forever, I felt like Rachel again, not just a mom and wife. When Mike would ask about my therapy progress, I'd tell him I was working through some deep childhood trauma and needed patience. Then I met Kevin at the gym, where I'd started going as part of my self-care routine. He was a personal trainer who was 28 and going through a rough patch with his wife Lisa. Kevin told me Lisa was always criticizing him and making him feel worthless, and when I shared that I was dealing with depression, he immediately offered to train me for free, because exercise was so important for mental health. Kevin was so sweet and attentive during our sessions, always asking how I was feeling and encouraging me when I felt overwhelmed. He said his wife didn't understand his passion for helping people and that I was inspiring him to be a better trainer. When he suggested we grab dinner after a particularly emotional session, I thought, why not? since Mike was always working late anyway. Kevin made me feel young and energetic again, like I could conquer anything. He would text me motivational quotes every morning and tell me how proud he was of my progress, both physically and mentally. When we ended up spending time together outside the gym one evening, I told myself this was just part of my journey to rediscover who I was underneath all the depression and numbness. I was juggling David on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Kevin on Saturdays and felt like I was finally living again. Mike noticed I seemed happier and credited my therapy, which made me feel terrible, but also validated that what I was doing was working. I told him my therapist said I was making breakthrough progress and just needed to stay consistent with treatment. That's when I met Carlos at work when he came in for a dental cleaning. He was a lawyer going through a messy separation from his wife Maria, and he looked so lost sitting in our waiting room. When I checked him in, he started telling me about how Maria had turned all their friends against him, and I felt such a connection because I understood feeling isolated and misunderstood. Carlos was sophisticated and intelligent in ways that made me realize how much I'd been settling in my marriage. He would call me during his lunch breaks just to hear my voice and tell me I was the only bright spot in his day. When I mentioned my depression, he said his wife had also struggled with mental health, and he knew how important it was to have someone who truly understood your pain. Carlos would take me to nice restaurants in the next town, over where no one knew us, and treat me like a queen, ordering wine and asking about my dreams and goals. He made me feel intellectually stimulated for the first time in years, and when he said I deserved so much better than a husband who couldn't even recognize my struggles, I started to believe him. Around month 5, I also connected with Jake, who was my neighbor's husband when I was walking our dog. Jake worked from home doing IT consulting and told me he felt so lonely because his wife Amanda was always traveling for work. He seemed so genuine and down to earth, and when he noticed I looked sad one day and asked if I was okay, I found myself opening up about my depression. Jake was the best listener and would invite me over for coffee when Amanda was out of town, just so I wouldn't feel alone. He understood what it was like to feel invisible in your own marriage and would validate all my feelings about needing more emotional support. Jake made me feel understood in a way that was different from the others, more gentle and caring. When Jake suggested we go for weekend hikes together, since exercise was good for depression, I thought it was sweet how much he cared about my well-being. We would talk for hours about our dreams and disappointments, and I felt like I could be completely honest with him about everything except the other men, obviously. The 5th man was Dr. Peterson, who I met when Mike insisted I actually go to therapy to appease him. Dr. Peterson was in his 50s and recently divorced, and when I told him about feeling trapped and depressed, he was so empathetic. He said he specialized in helping women rediscover themselves after years of losing their identity to marriage and motherhood. Dr. Peterson made me feel like my feelings were completely valid and that I shouldn't feel guilty for wanting more out of life. He would schedule our sessions for the end of the day, and we would talk for hours about my dreams and aspirations. When he said he'd never met someone as insightful and resilient as me, I felt like finally someone saw the real Rachel. All 5 relationships made me feel like I was pieces of myself I'd lost over the years. David made me feel desired. Kevin made me feel strong. Carlos made me feel intelligent. Jake made me feel understood. And Dr. Peterson made me feel worthy. I convinced myself this was all part of my healing process, and that once I felt whole again, I could be a better wife and mother. I was careful to keep everyone separate, and told each of them slightly different versions of my depression story, depending on what would get the most sympathy. With David, I focused on feeling neglected by Mike. With Kevin, I talked about body image issues with Carlos. I emphasized intellectual loneliness with Jake. I shared feeling emotionally abandoned, and with Dr. Peterson, I discussed losing my sense of self. For months, I felt like I was living 5 different lives, and finally experiencing all the passion and excitement I'd been missing. Mike kept commenting on how much better I seemed and asking about my therapy progress, which made me feel proud that my plan was working so well. I told him my therapist said I was making excellent progress, but still needed time to work through deep-seated issues. The first crack appeared when Jennifer David's wife started getting suspicious about his evening activities. David told me she'd been asking questions about where he was going, and that we needed to be more careful. I suggested we only meet during lunch hours when she was at work, but he seemed nervous and distant, which hurt my feelings, since I thought what we had was special. Around the same time, Kevin mentioned that Lisa had been going through his phone and found some of our text messages. He tried to pass them off as client communications, but she wasn't buying it and had started demanding to see his work schedule. Kevin asked if we could cool things down for a while, which felt like a rejection and made my depression symptoms actually start to feel real. Then Carlos told me Maria had hired a private investigator as part of their divorce proceedings, and he was worried about being seen with me in public. He said we should only meet at discreet locations from now on, which made me feel cheap and used when I thought he genuinely cared about me as a person. I started to feel like maybe these men were just using me for companionship while pretending to care about my emotional well-being. Jake became distant after Amanda came home early from a business trip and almost caught us together in their kitchen. He said it was too risky to keep meeting and that he needed to focus on his marriage, which felt like abandonment when I thought he understood me better than anyone. I couldn't believe he would just throw away our connection like it meant nothing. The worst part was when Dr. Peterson suddenly terminated our therapeutic relationship, saying he felt there were boundary issues developing. He referred me to another therapist and said it wouldn't be appropriate to continue our sessions, which left me feeling completely betrayed since I thought he of all people would support my healing journey. Within 2 weeks, all 5 men had essentially dumped me, and I was spiraling into what felt like actual depression for the first time. I had no one to talk to about what I was going through, since I couldn't exactly tell Mike or my friends about losing 5 affair partners simultaneously. I felt more alone and worthless than ever before, and started questioning whether any of them had actually cared about me. That's when everything completely fell apart. Jennifer found receipts in David's truck and confronted me in the grocery store parking lot, screaming about how I was a homewrecker who destroyed families. She said she knew about all my lies, and that she was going to make sure everyone in town knew what kind of person I really was. Lisa showed up at my work the next day with printed screenshots of text messages between me and Kevin, demanding to speak with my boss about my unprofessional conduct with clients' husbands. She told my boss I was using my position to seduce married men and threatened to leave negative reviews online if they didn't take action against me. Maria, the lawyer's wife, was the worst because she had actual legal resources. She somehow found out about all 5 affairs and created a whole presentation with timelines and evidence that she planned to use in her divorce case. She called Mike and invited him to lunch where she laid out everything I'd been doing with photos and text messages and witness statements. Amanda confronted me at Emma's school during pickup and made a huge scene in front of all the other parents, calling me a manipulative liar who preyed on vulnerable husbands. She said I'd used fake depression as an excuse to destroy multiple marriages and that I was disgusting for abandoning my own children to chase after married men. The absolute worst was when my actual therapist, the one Dr. Peterson had referred me to, called Mike directly to clarify that she'd never recommended the treatment plan I'd been claiming. She told him I'd only seen her twice and that there was no indication of clinical depression in my assessment, which completely destroyed my cover story. Mike confronted me that evening with a folder full of evidence that the wives had compiled, including Receipts dating app, screenshots, text message conversations, and testimony from multiple sources. He said he couldn't believe I'd used mental health as a lie to justify having inappropriate relationships, and that he'd been worried sick about me while I was out destroying other families. I tried to explain that I really had been struggling and that these relationships helped me work through my feelings, but Mike said that wasn't depression, that was just selfishness. He told me he'd already contacted a lawyer and filed for emergency custody of the kids because he couldn't trust me to prioritize their well-being over my own desires. The worst part was when Emma asked me why Mrs. Jennifer had called me a bad word at the store, and why Daddy was so sad all the time. I didn't know how to explain that Mommy had made some mistakes while trying to feel better about herself, because how do you tell a 10-year-old that you faked being sick to justify having affairs? Josh started having nightmares and asking if I was going to leave like Tommy's mum did, which broke my heart because I never meant for any of this to affect the kids. Mike said the children were confused and scared because of my behavior and that they needed stability, which he couldn't provide while I was living in the same house. Within a week, Mike had moved me into the studio apartment and filed for divorce with full custody, pending a psychological evaluation. All 5 wives had gotten restraining orders against me, and my boss had suspended me, pending an internal investigation into my conduct. I went from having 5 men who claimed to love me to having no one who would even speak to me. The grocery store incident with Jennifer had been witnessed by several people, including my neighbor and Mike's sister, so word spread quickly through our social circle. People I'd known for years started crossing the street to avoid me, and my phone stopped ringing because no one wanted to be associated with the scandal. My own sister Lisa called to tell me she was ashamed of my behavior and couldn't understand how I'd used mental health as an excuse to cheat on my husband and abandon my children. She said Mum and Dad were humiliated and didn't want to see me until I got serious help for my problems, which felt like the ultimate betrayal from my own family. The psychological evaluation was a nightmare because the court-appointed therapist immediately saw through my depression claims and said I showed signs of narcissistic behavior patterns rather than clinical depression. I'd spent hours the night before researching depression symptoms online and practicing how to describe my feelings in ways that would sound convincing, but Dr. Martinez was clearly more experienced than I'd anticipated. She started with basic questions about my mood and sleep patterns, which I answered perfectly based on my research, but then she began asking about specific incidents and timelines that didn't match up with what I'd told Mike and the therapists. When she asked me to describe a typical day during my worst depressive episodes, I tried to paint a picture of lying in bed, unable to function, but she pointed out that my credit card statements showed I was quite active during those same periods. Dr. Martinez asked about my relationships with the 5 men, and I tried to explain that I'd been seeking emotional support during my mental health crisis, but she kept pushing for details about how these relationships started and progressed. I told her these men had been helping me cope with my depression and that the wives were just jealous of the emotional connections we'd formed, but she looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. The worst part was when she administered these psychological tests that were supposed to measure depression and personality disorders, and I could tell from her facial expressions that my answers weren't fitting the patterns she expected. I tried to emphasize how much I'd been suffering and how no one understood my pain, but she kept taking notes and asking follow-up questions that made me feel like she was trying to trap me. When she asked about my children, I explained that I'd been doing my best to be a good mother, despite my struggles, but that Mike hadn't been supportive of my healing journey. Dr. Martinez wanted to know specific examples of how my depression affected my parenting, and I told her about feeling overwhelmed and needing breaks, which is why I'd been going to therapy so often, but she seemed skeptical about my timeline. The evaluation took 3 hours, and by the end, I felt completely drained and misunderstood, just like I had with everyone else in this whole situation. Dr. Martinez explained that she would be writing a comprehensive report for the court, but that her preliminary findings suggested I didn't meet the criteria for major depressive disorder, and that my behavior patterns indicated other underlying issues that needed to be addressed. She recommended supervised visitation only until I completed extensive therapy, which meant I could only see my own children for 2 hours twice a week with a social worker present, watching everything I said and did. The social worker would be evaluating whether I was making progress in understanding how my actions affected my family, and whether I could prioritize the children's emotional needs over my own desires. Mike has been cold and businesslike in all our interactions, focused only on logistics about the kids and divorce proceedings. When I tried to explain that I'd been genuinely struggling with feeling trapped and unappreciated, He said that didn't excuse lying and cheating and destroying multiple families in the process. The 5 men have all blocked me on everything and won't respond to any attempts at contact, which hurts because I thought at least some of them had genuine feelings for me. David actually changed his phone number after Jennifer threatened to call the police if I kept trying to reach him, which seemed like an overreaction since we'd had real emotional intimacy. Kevin posted on social media about overcoming betrayal and moving forward with his wife, which felt like a slap in the face since I'd been nothing but supportive during his difficult time. Carlos sent me a cease and desist letter through his law firm demanding I stop all contact, which seemed unnecessarily harsh considering how much we'd shared about our dreams and goals. Jake pretended not to see me when I tried to talk to him while walking the dog and actually went back inside his house rather than acknowledge me, which was cowardly after everything we'd meant to each other. Dr. Peterson's secretary told me he'd relocated his practice to another city, which felt like running away from the connection we'd built during our sessions. I'm sitting here in this depressing apartment that smells like someone else's cooking, trying to figure out where everything went wrong. All I wanted was to feel alive and appreciated again after years of being taken for granted, but somehow that makes me the villain in everyone's story. Mike says I manipulated and lied and used people, but I genuinely cared about all 5 men and thought they cared about me too. If what we had was real, then why did they all abandon me the second things got complicated instead of fighting for what we'd built together? The wives act like I'm some kind of monster, but they don't understand what it's like to feel invisible in your own life, watching everyone else live with passion while you slowly disappear into background noise. I never meant to hurt anyone. I just wanted to remember what it felt like to be desired and valued and heard. Maybe I should have been more upfront about my struggles instead of calling it depression, but I needed some way to explain why I felt so empty inside. Mike acts like I made the whole thing up, but the feelings were real, even if the clinical diagnosis wasn't accurate. I still think about David and how he made me feel beautiful, and Kevin, who believed in my strength, and Carlos, who respected my intelligence, and Jake, who listened to my heart, and Dr. Peterson, who validated my worth. They all filled different pieces of what was missing in my marriage and helped me rediscover parts of myself I'd lost. Now I have nothing and no one, and I'm supposed to pretend like this is justice when all I did was try to save myself from drowning in a life that was slowly killing my spirit. Everyone else gets to move on and rebuild while I'm left here, wondering if I'll ever see my children grow up or find someone who understands what I was really going through. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.